Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shauna-Kay Rainford. She's a friend and colleague. We overlapped at Penn State University some years ago. She even was so generous to babysit my 6-month-old son, which very few people would volunteer for such an opportunity. So she got her undergraduate degree at Cornell University and then continued on to get her doctorate at Penn State University. In 2019, she moved all the way across the pond to Switzerland to begin her postdoc at the University of Bern. She'll be presenting on that research here today. So she worked at the Institute of Plant Science, and her project aim was to understand the impact of climate and the anthropogenic disturbance of vegetation dynamics near Lake Murten, which is in the western part of Switzerland. She'll talk about that today. So this site is of particular interest because it was near the ancient Roman city of Aventicum, if I'm pronouncing that right. And this December, she is starting a position with the agricultural research organization Agroscope, which is affiliated with the Swiss federal government. So when she's not at work, she enjoys Switzerland, of course, even though America is her true home. And when she goes home, it's so nice to hear English, and it's just a welcoming sound. But in Switzerland, she enjoys the life there, hiking in the mountains, doing long distance bike rides with her husband. And there's few places I know more beautiful than Switzerland. So with that, welcome, Dr. Rainford.
Thanks for the kind words, Lily. Hi, everyone. My name is Shauna Rainford, and I would like to share with you what lake sediments can teach us about the past. During this presentation, I will provide you with a brief outline of my postdoctoral research. And this research is entitled A High Temporal Resolution Record of Vegetation, Land Use, and Fire Dynamics during the Roman period at Lake Murten, Switzerland. So during this presentation, I will first present a bit about the area, a brief history of the area, as well as talk about just a few points about the study site, then note a few of the gaps in our understanding of the past before delving into the main objectives of the project. Then I'd like to spend some time talking about the methods that were used to carry out the studies. Specifically, I really want to talk about our sample collection and preparation, as well as the multi-proxy techniques that were employed to examine our samples. And lastly, I will share some of our findings before summarizing the main takeaways from the investigation. So our study takes place in Lake Murten, or Murtensee in German, and it is the smallest of 3 interconnected lakes that are located in the lowlands of the Swiss plateau. And the study explores the interaction between climate, vegetation, and land use. And it is this nexus that has been among the most discussed topics in studies of Swiss Neolithic and Bronze Age lakeside sediments since they were discovered over 150 years ago. And archaeological investigations in and around Murten have revealed that this prehistoric environment included prehistoric settlers, such as the pile dweller communities, the Celtic tribes, and also the Romans during different time periods, of course. And here you can see at the bottom a really nice view of Lake Murten. So the area around Lake Murten is of particular interest due to its proximity, as Lily mentioned, to the ancient city of Aventicum, which was the capital of the Roman province Helvetia. And it's thought that Aventicum dates back to about 2,000 years ago, to the 1st century AD. And the city, as you can see in these photos, was pretty extensive. And it is believed that it held a population of about 20,000 inhabitants at its peak. And archaeological finds also show that the Roman occupation of this area, during this time, there were homes, there were farms, and a number of important buildings that included public thermal baths and theaters, including this amphitheater on the bottom right, which survives to this day. So the figure on the right in this slide also provides a really good illustration of the historical finds from Aventicum. But if you want to learn more about the history of the area and studying about the different kinds of archaeological investigations, this study is really great. But while investigations such as these can help to establish linkages between prehistoric societies and certain land use practices, These records, however, are almost always discontinuous due to the shifting of prehistoric sediments over time and also the degradation of culturally significant remains. And this really results in a lack of knowledge about the past. Specifically, we don't really have an idea of the impact of this important, both in the sense of economics and culture, this important society on the surrounding landscape. And this lack of knowledge is significant because their understanding of succession trajectories in response to both climate and human forcing is crucial for the development of sound conservation management strategies under global change conditions. So Lily mentioned that the central aim of this project is to investigate the impact of climate and land use activities on vegetation dynamics around Murten. And if you think of this area of science as kind of like a puzzle, think of the important work of archaeologists as a few of the edge and center pieces, because their work really cements the foundation of our knowledge by allowing us to understand who and what we're studying. But with this knowledge alone, the puzzle is incomplete. Bar sediment really provides an opportunity for us to study the interactions between climate, vegetation, and land use with exceptional temporal resolution, because these laminations are deposited seasonally, in that these light calcium-rich summer layers are deposited in pairs with dark organic winter layers, and they together denote annual increments that can be counted. So since time forms the backbone of our studies, you can kind of think of chronology as the size of the puzzle piece that helps us to clarify the resolution of our picture of the past. And historically, sedimentary chronologies were established using AMS, radiocarbon dating on macrofossils, which may have a 95% confidence interval that spans hundreds, even sometimes thousands of years, and the so-called wiggle matching of C14 dates. So this requires the use of C14 dates and some kind of knowledge of the dates that span the gap between our known dates. When you combine this technology, you can use it to reduce the chronological error to decadal or even sometimes sub-decadal precision. And in the study, we use the laminations found in Lake Murten to help elucidate the underlying mechanisms that influence the past vegetation assemblage and the proximity of this important Swiss urban center during the Roman time. Specifically, we aim to construct a decadal resolution record of past land use, fire, and vegetation interactions using multi-proxy analyses. And to further examine the impact of climate on vegetation dynamics in this area, the dynamic landscape model, LANCLIN, was used to simulate vegetation composition and succession under different climate and disturbance scenarios. In October 2019, our group retrieved 3 parallel cores from the deepest part of the lake basin using a UV-Tech piston core. So these photos up top are of the UV-Tech platform, and this is where the piston core is controlled through a series of pulleys. And below the water, this specific core is designed to extract saturated sediments without significant disturbance to the sample. So when the core is lowered and the plastic tube is driven into the sediment, it's driven over a metal piston that is fixed in place. And the metal weight is used to hammer in this plastic tube deeper and deeper into the lake bottom. And because there's now a vacuum between the piston and the sample below it, we're able to extract intact cores. Next, we have our cores and we take them back to the lab. And we extracted sediment blocks and impregnated them with epoxy resin. These 3 photos shows you a bit of the preparation we did for these kinds of samples, in that the top photo shows you how the sediment blocks were extracted using kind of like this waffle-like tool. This is the handle, and we put these blocks in the core and then we extracted them using this waffle tool. And then in order to harden the sediment, because essentially the sediment, it moves around a lot and you need it to be in place, we covered it with liquid nitrogen that's shown here at the bottom with the guy with the gloves. And then we impregnated it. That basically just means we filled in all of the pore space within the sediment blocks with resin to harden this sediment. And then it was later cut and cut and then polished. So we have a smooth surface. And then line and area scans of these resin blocks were conducted with the Bruker M4 Tornado. It's a micro XRF machine that was used to facilitate the VARV counting and the measuring of changes in the geological signature along the core. So I'm going to turn on our laser pointer here. Here, this first photo shows you what a block looks like. You can't really see any of the VARVs, but once it's scanned and you see the geochemical signature, in this case, this is of calcium. You see in this area scan, the areas of high intensity, which are denoted by this red color. And then the green color is medium intensity and purple, where there is low intensity. And then the line scans, you can see like different peaks in calcium. So first the VARVs were counted by denoting these peaks in calcium that were along 3 independent line scans. And then the counts were verified using the area scan of the high calcium intensity found in the mapped area. Next, we found 10 terrestrial plant macrofossils. They were collected and dated. This photo gives a really good idea of what a macrofossil looks like. Basically, it's just like a fragment of a plant that can be dated, and it's found within the core. And it really gives us an idea of the time, as I mentioned before. So this was carried out, like the aging of these macrofossils was carried out here at the University of Bern. And these radiocarbon dates were then calibrated in this program called OxCal using the IntCal20 curve. And an outlier analysis was conducted using OxCal as well. And based on the results of this outlier analysis, a C14 wiggle matched age depth model was created using the interval function and the OxCal P sequence model. So we employed a number of multi-proxy techniques to help us better understand the different aspects of the past. And if we can return to our puzzle analogy, each of these techniques can be said to represent a different puzzle piece that helps us fill in the gaps of our understanding of the impacts of things like agropastoral activities, the impacts of fire and climate on the vegetation dynamics. And it is the combined use of these multi-proxy techniques such as pollen analysis, the analysis of charcoal, as well as dynamic modeling that may help us elucidate the timing and underlying factors that influence the succession around Lake Murten during the Roman period. So a total of 70 samples were removed from the sediment core to reconstruct both the vegetation history and also the fire history. And they were extracted during the study interval along the core. So prior to treatment, lycopodium tablets were added to determine the pollen and charcoal concentrations, as well as the charcoal influx. And samples were prepared following standard methods and mounted in glycerin. And within each of these samples, the identification of at least 500 pollen grains and spores was conducted. And to develop the charcoal record, we identified at least 200 grains and spores. And the identification of these pollen grains was aided by the reference collection here at the University of Bern. Okay, so from this analysis, we were able to use a number of proxies to infer information about the surrounding environment. I'm sure you've already assessed that from the pollen record, we learn a lot about the vegetation, but we also learn about numerous other environmental conditions and anthropogenic activities such as farming that can be inferred from the presence or absence of specific pollen taxa. And we used the microscopic charcoal as a proxy for the regional fire regime. And we also used the presence of this spore called Sporomella and specific fungal spores to denote the presence of large herbivores within the vicinity of the lakeshore. And then Langclim, this is my favorite part. The dynamic forest model Langclim was used to simulate vegetation composition and succession within a 5-kilometer radius of Lake Murten. So Langland incorporates a fine resolution grid. So it's mimicking the landscape on a 25 meter by 25 meter cells to simulate the forest dynamics and also large scaled disturbance over a long period of time. So it can simulate these things over hundreds of years or even thousands of years. And within each cell is a spatially explicit model that's running separately to represent the unique soil and topographical input variables that are shown here. So you have the landscape mask and the land type, and they delineate areas where vegetation is permitted to grow and also where disturbance is allowed to occur. While the soil bucket size is estimated from present-day soil conditions of the study area, and the aspect and slope are derived from the digital elevation model. So this program also uses a simplified gap model to simulate tree establishment, tree growth, competition amongst the trees, and also mortality of the trees within each grid cell. And this is conducted at an annual time step. Whereas the disturbance models are simulated in 10-year time steps. So you get an idea of how all of these components are changing, both the composition of the forest and also the biomass of the forest in 10-year time steps. So we simulated 3 scenarios in Langland to examine the linkages between climate, fire, and land use across the landscape. Specifically, we examined the impact of differences in precipitation, fire size, fire frequency, and ignition level, as well as browsing. This first scenario assesses the effect of varying climate by simulating the Holocene temperature record with incremental differences in modern precipitation abundance. So the reason why we did this is that we don't really have an idea of what the precipitation level was like in the past. We have a lot of really good papers and experiments that explore the temperature record. So that's pretty solid, that we know. But precipitation, we don't really know how much higher in relation to our modern precipitation levels, what occurred in the past. So this experiment attempted to clarify this gap in our knowledge. And the fire scenario mimics our increasing human land use by characterizing different levels of fire size, fire frequency, and also the ignition. And the third scenario assesses the forest susceptibility to browsing by ungulates. So here we parameterize the model using a no, a low, and moderate level of browsing pressure. And to validate the model inputs, or outputs really, the inputs we've already described. So to validate the model outputs, we compared the simulated vegetation to the observed pollen data. And let's dive into our results. So first, we were able to count 67 barbs in the distinctly barbed section of the core. And this corresponds to roughly the years 128 to 204 AD. And using the barb count in our C14 dates, we're able to conduct this wiggle match sequence model, and the results of which are shown here on the left. So as you can see here, the age time is plotted on the x-axis, while depth is plotted on the y-axis. And a photograph our entire study interval, like the entire segment of the core that we examined, is plotted here at the side. So this black line shows the result of our p-sequence model chronology, and the gray lines represent the 95% confidence interval of this model. The black dots show the calibrated ages of our radiocarbon dated terrestrial plant macrofossils with their 2 sigma error bars. The 2 red dots represent the 2 outlier samples that were not included in the model. And these numbers basically just indicate the sample numbers. So based on these results, we found that our study interval covers about 265 years between the years 20 BC and the year 245 AD. And this is pretty nice in the sense that usually paleoecological studies span thousands of years. So to have a very short amount of time with high clarity is really different in this field. And there is a mean model uncertainty of 47.5 calibrated years. And this is pretty high resolution. It's not near like the thousands of years that is possible, and it's certainly not in the hundreds. So this is pretty good. We have a really good idea of the timing of events with this study. And archaeological studies of the area around Murten have found that the Celtic tribes that existed in this area, they were defeated and they were starting to be forced out of the region by the Roman army around 58 BC. And we know that Aventicum, it's thought that it dates back to the year 1 to 10 AD. So we can infer from these results that our study interval includes the beginning of the Roman occupation of the area. So this is really nice. So we have the first 265 years of the Roman occupation of the area around Lake Murten. And next we see the results of the pollen diagram. This diagram is a bit different than what you're used to, and it may be a little confusing at first. So I'll take everything slowly and we'll go in turn. So basically this diagram is just composed of a series of graphs of the observed pollen taxa. And each of these pollen taxa, the trees and the shrubs you see here, represent different kinds of vegetation. So on the x-axis, it shows the percent of the total arboreal pollen for each of the pollen taxa, while the y-axis shows both depth and time along the sediment core. So on the far left, we have the dates of the uncalibrated macrofossils that were used to establish time. We have our depth, and also we have two scales of time. Time is recorded on this graph, both in calibrated years BC and also years AD and BC. And the way these models work with regards to time is that time goes upwards in the sense that towards the bottom is the oldest part of our record, and the top is the newest or closest to present part of our record. And next, we have our core lithology, and we see that this core was composed mostly of calcareous gytia, and we also show where the laminations occurred along the core. So the rest of the pollen diagram shows the composition of both the vegetation and also the macroscopic charcoal. So we have both the vegetation history here and the fire history over here. There's a lot, but the way you read these diagrams is that you follow this LPAC. It stands for the local pollen assemblage zone. And basically, this is the statistically significant demarcation of the data, like how the data in the vegetation composition is changing over time. So we'll start by describing the very first through the last one. So based on the pollen that we found in this MUR1 zone, we start with an environment that is dominated by these coniferous trees and also by deciduous trees. And this indicates the presence of a relic deciduous forest and the presence of other pollen taxa, which are not shown, unfortunately, because due to spacing issues. Imagine like there's double this graph for the herbs. So we'll denote changes in the herbs based on this graph. So here you have the trees, the shrubs, and the herbs. So based on the presence of other pollen taxa, such as like crop plants, we know that humans existed during this time, and there was a lot of human agricultural activity. And this charcoal record also shows that the regional fire activity was marked by two prominent peaks. So there were two large fire events, like around this time and towards the end of the zone. And this tells us, yes, that these two peaks occurred. It also tells us that the fire regime was lowered between this time, 23 BC and the year 16 AD. And archaeological evidence tells us that this area, of course, was occupied by the Celtic tribes, and they were being removed by the Romans. So this decrease in fire activity around here may indicate the removal of the Celtic tribes in the sense that there are a lot of people, they created a lot of fire, there are fewer people being shoved out, and then the Romans came. So you may see the rise of the Roman population. So the next zone shows a shift in the landscape as the percentage of the trees and the shrubs start to decrease and the percentage of the herbs start to increase. And pollen taxa that are known to be influenced by the presence of the Romans, such as the Euglins plants here. So this Euglins taxa, the Euglins is pretty much, it's just a scientific name for walnut. and other taxa indicative of Roman occupation become more prevalent. So this suggests that the agriculture activity by the Romans started to increase during this period. And we also see a similar result based on the fire history, in that the amount of both charcoal concentration and influx, they start to increase during this period. And it's during this zone that they're at the record high of this time. So the co-occurrence of these high fire activities, as well as the pollen taxa that are indicative of open environment landscapes, suggests a correlation between the increased fire and the opening of the landscape. And then during this third zone, things become really interesting in the sense that we know that this Quercus is an oak tree. We know that the Romans started to plant Quercus. As you see, when the Romans began to occupy the area, the amount of Quercus increased, and we know they planted it for fodder for their animals. But in MUR3, you see the Quercus begins to decrease in the sense that there are fewer Romans planting this specific crop during this time. And the increase of other pollen species, particularly with the Corylus, you see here, and the Betula, as well as the Alnus, these are pioneer forest species in the sense that these are the species that naturally invade an area after a huge disturbance. So the decrease of the Quercus and the increase of these other plants suggests the start of a possible land abandonment phase during this zone. And this is also corroborated with the fire history in the sense that the fires begin to drastically decrease. You see like a complete decrease in the fire regime. So we know maybe there are fewer people in this area during this time. So prior to the study, we never really knew when the Romans began to leave the area, and this change in vegetation composition, coupled with the decrease in charcoal concentration, may indicate that there is a smaller imprint of humans on the environment. And then lastly, we have the last two zones, MUR4 and MUR5, that are indicative of a recovery of the forest environment. So you see the continued increase of some of these pioneer species, particularly Betula and Alnus throughout these zones. And also the charcoal concentration and influx remains low during this time. And this suggests that the fire activity remained low in the catchment throughout these two zones. All right. So here are the results of our geochemical analysis from the high resolution spectroscopy or scans of these elements. So the first part shows the downcore profiles of the elemental scans of calcium, potassium, titanium, and iron, and manganese. And below, you see a zoomed in version of the spatial distribution of the elements over a few varv years. So I'm not sure if you can see it, but I hope you can. The varv years are delineated on these graphs with the lighter dotted gray lines. And they denote like the light summer layers. And as you can see here, calcium shows an inverse correlation with both potassium, titanium, and iron. And this is clearly seen here on these zoomed in scans, particularly right here. So I should say that in all of these scans, they're all independent for the specific element above it. So in all of the scans, the areas of high intensity those areas are denoted by the lighter colors. So you see this area here, it's pretty dark, indicating that the amount of calcium is pretty low. You'll see a huge increase in the other elements, the other three elements. And calcium is a good indicator of the primary productivity that's going on in the lake, while the other three that are reported here are called heterogeneous elements. So these are the elements that give us an idea of what's going on around the lake, in the sense that they give us a very good idea of the amount of erosion that's going on. So increased layers or increased amounts tells us that there's a lot of runoff, while the opposite tells us that there's decrease in the amount of runoff. So from these results, we can say that the summer, there were increased levels of primary productivity, while the winter, there was increased amounts of runoff. And you can see that downpour variations in manganese, the concentration was relatively constant, except for this prominent peak here in this area between 495 and 498 centimeters along the core. And this occurs right before the varves start to form. And basically, manganese tells us a good idea about the level of oxygen within the lake. And high levels of manganese tells us that the lake was oxygenated. We do not know from the results of the study why this occurred, but it's really interesting that this level, like two things happened. First, like the lake was largely anoxic, and then that completely changed for a very short period of time. This is about less than 10, 20 years period of time, and then it drastically changed back. So much so it became so anoxic that varves began to form. And this is notable because usually when a lake loses its oxygen, it's due to warm weather or increase in fertilizers or excessive plant growth. These factors cause a decrease in the oxygen levels. So it tells us that something significant happened around this time, and it was so large that it drastically altered the geochemistry of the lake. And here we have the results of our land claim simulations. So it's definitely impossible to show all of the iterations of the various scenarios. So it's important to note before we delve into the actual results that what you see here are the results of different levels of browsing. So you have no browsing, low browsing, and moderate browsing denoted by the columns, and different amounts of precipitation, which are denoted by the various rows. And these are all simulations with the fire scenario characterized by large frequent fires at the low level of fire ignition. And at the top here, we have the results of our pollen diagram. So these are the results you saw 2 slides back. And we have the different colors of the various plant species that were modeled. And the colors are denoted equally in both graphs. So Alnus Abies alba is always this color in this graph and in these graphs below. Alrighty, so based on these simulations, we found that land claim simulations with precipitation levels that were higher than modern day abundance, and also land claim simulations with moderate browsing levels were most reflective of the pollen record. So we'll start with the precipitation first. So you'll notice that in these simulations was 90% and less of 90% and 80% of modern day abundance, there's a notable decrease in the simulated biomass of these plants. So much so that even at the 80%, when the precipitation level is too low, a random fire event triggered a secondary succession event where all of the plants died. That's what these things indicate. All of the plants died and they all had to regrow. And here it's less prominent. But what's important is that this is not reflected, this decrease in the vegetation composition of really any of the important plant species. It's just not found here in the pollen record. And next, we found that in situations with high levels of precipitation levels and the moderate browsing, the vegetation composition of these models were more reflective of the pollen diagram, most specifically with this Abies alba plant. So Abies alba is a conifer, it's a spruce, and it's a really important plant here in Switzerland in that it's often found in the high altitude areas. And since we are in the lowlands of the Swiss plateau, it is very unlikely that this plant grew here. And this is reflected here in the observed pollen diagram and not reflected when browsing levels were when there was no browsing or very low browsing. So we say that the combination of both moderate browsing and precipitation levels higher than higher than modern day abundance is most reflective of the pollen diagram. And it's important to note that the impact of fire size, fire frequency, and ignition level was not really emphasized here in the Langklim output. So much so that I made no attempts to show you the differences in the fire scenarios because there were no discernible differences, like the differences in both the vegetation composition and also the simulated biomass were negligible. And this means that across different kinds of fire regimes, the major plant taxa that were simulated there were no huge changes. And this is also corroborated by the pollen diagram in the sense that where we saw there was a huge fire increase when the Romans occupied the area versus towards the beginning and end of the record, where there was less of a signature of fire, the composition relatively remained the same. So use these results to corroborate also our observed pollen record. So this high resolution study clearly outlines the impact of Roman prehistoric lake dwelling communities on the regional vegetation dynamics around Lake Murten. And the combined use of these multi-proxy techniques really provide a succinct and cohesive records, all of these records of the vegetation, the land use, and the fire histories of the region. And overall, we know that the vegetation composition interpreted from the pollen data indicated that the forest was dominated mostly by beeches and oaks. And this forested landscape experienced extensive land use in a moderate to high fire regime after the Romans occupied the area. But this high resolution record also increases our current understanding of the Romans' retreat from the area by documenting the first land abandonments indicated by a decrease in the fire regime and plans indicative of agropastoral activities. So the comparison of the pollen data to Langklim also expands upon the impact of precipitation, browsing, and also fire, even though it was a quote negative result during this time. And in summary, the potential of this wiggle matching methodology with VAR sediments really creates a robust chronological record that formed the backbone of this study. And the multi-proxy techniques employed here can really be utilized for other detailed investigations of past environmental change. So we'll end with this image of our puzzle. This is how we started with this experiment, having very limited knowledge about the past. But it is our aim that a few of these multi-proxy techniques really helps to examine and uncover what happened in the past. It helps to clarify this image. It's really important to note that, of course, this image is not complete, and you definitely need a time machine in order to have a very crystal clear image of the past. But the point here is to gain a better understanding. And I'd like to conclude with my acknowledgements. This study was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, the University of Bern, and also the university's Oscar Center for Climate Change Research. And I would also like to thank my colleagues with their help in the field and in the lab, and also my peers at ETH, Dominique and Hassan, for helping me with all of my Langklim related questions. And with that, I'm really happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rainford. You all can type in your questions into the chat and I will read them off. And in the meantime, I have more of a general question for you, and that is, why are the cores taken underwater in the lake versus on land?
Because water preserves the data and all of the data that we use. If these studies were conducted, let's say on top of the mountain, like just in the air, we wouldn't have the preservation of these pollen grains.
And how deep is the lake? Or what depth did you actually take those cores from?
Yeah, the deepest part of the lake, I believe, is 41 meters.
So we don't have any questions yet, but I have my own.
Okay.
I was curious about the charcoal and the fire history.
Mhm.
And is this when the trends go up and down in terms of human population, like correlating with greater abundance of people, is that just fire from cooking, or is this would you expect to have large peaks from like a battle or the fire
Yeah.
burning or like the village burning down with transfer of power?
No, this is a very good question. And this is like a whole field in of itself in paleoecology, to be honest, like a subfield. My PI, he received his PhD just on this field alone. So the signature that is registered with the kinds of microfossils that we examine, it's a regional signature, and you can denote like the size of the different kinds of fires, like the extent, based on the size of the charcoal that's deposited. So we measure a specific size of charcoal within these samples. And we're denoting a regional signature of essentially wildfires.
Interesting. So there's a question from Dr. Petty, and he says, I'm familiar with paleolimnology using diatoms and sediments to understand water quality.
Yep.
Has anyone looked at diatoms in your course?
Not to my knowledge. There is a group at ETH who conducted a paleolimnology study, and they're assessing the eutrophication in Lake Murten, in the sense that only certain parts of the sediment in this lake, only certain parts are barbed, in the sense that like right now things are like the sediments barbed because there's a huge impact of the humans, i.e. there are a lot of people here, and they definitely change the chemistry of the sediments that are being deposited. And that's what's interested with these Romans in the signature. Like their signature on the landscape was so large that they impacted the lake similarly to how we're impacting the lake now. But to my knowledge, that's the only study I know of with that speciality.
So we have another question, and it's, is there any written record to verify the fire record?
No, 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 unfortunately not. A lot of the records of this area, it's really summarized here. You can see the actual literature reference of this study. It's pretty much like the preeminent study of the archaeological findings and investigations that went on during this area. But no, there aren't any written records. Usually like the records are about like war and the movement of different things, different crops, for example.
Right. Now, I was curious, going back to our current levels of human impact, when you were saying that the magnesium flared up during that like very short period of time, and that was from a decrease in oxygen levels, what is the current oxygen levels of the lake today? How are humans impacting it right now?
That's a very good question. Honestly, I do not know. I only studied things in the past, to be honest.
I was just curious of relative levels. Yeah.
Yeah. But I can if I were to take an educated guess though, right now, because there are bars present at the top of the lake, we know that bars only form during anoxic conditions. So you would expect that the manganese to be lower because that is indicative of lower amounts of oxygen in the lake.
Right. Any other questions from our audience? Well, I have a curious, is LandClem, is that a GIS or an R-based program, or is that just totally separate on its own?
Yeah, it's completely different. You do have to organize your layers. Those layers, I always call it like the ingredients of a sandwich, in the sense that they all have to be just right in order to work in LangClim. But you get those layers together, and I built them in ArcGIS, and then I inputted them into LangClim. And LangClim works separately on a completely different server because it's just a lot of simulations.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much. It's a new something I've never heard about paleo.
Yeah, sure thing. If you guys have any questions, I'm sure if I can share my email somehow. Please feel free to contact me at any time.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. I'll stop sharing my screen.